Before I knew thee, hell, I knew nothing. And now a man should speak truly little better than one of the wicked. I was as virtuously given as a gentleman need to be. Virtuous enough. Swore a little. Dice not above 7 times a week. Went to a bawdy house not above once a quarter of an hour.
The first time I saw Chimes at Midnight was an experience I'll never forget. I went to Chicago. I was living in Madison, Wisconsin, was writing my book on Wells at the time, my first book. And it played for 5 nights at the Town Underground Theater near the University of Chicago. And I thought I might never get to see it again because the film wasn't being properly distributed in the U.S. And so I took the Greyhound bus down and I read the plays on the bus and saw the film 3 times in one night. And which was a tremendous experience. The audience was fascinating because they were, it seemed equal parts intellectuals from the University of Chicago and film buffs and winos, old winos. What was fascinating was everybody got the film and loved the film, and the winos got all the jokes. And I thought, you know, here's a film, it appeals to anybody. You don't really have to know the plays all that well to like the film. It helps, but if these old guys would get the film, Falstaff is sort of the king of winos anyway, you know.
If I had 1,000 sons, the first humane principle I would teach them would be this: to forswear thin quotations and to addict themselves to sack.
The film already had been killed basically by Bosley Crowther, who was a notoriously ignorant film critic for the New York Times at the time. I got some pretty good reviews in New York. Judith Christ and Pauline Kael gave it notably good reviews, but Kael's review is called Orson Welles' There Ain't No Way, which was a lament about no matter how good he would make a film like this, there's no way to reach a wide public. So when I saw the film in Chicago, I thought, when is it going to come to Madison, other places? So I actually picked up the phone and called Carl Peppercorn, who was the distributor. And here was this 19-year-old kid calling him, and he seemed irked that I was pestering him, like, when are you going to release this film nationwide? And it's a great film. And he was defensive. And he said basically Crowther had discouraged him from thinking the film was worth distributing. So the film disappeared for a long time. It was on DVD a few times. It was on VHS once, but those came and went, and they didn't get much distribution. When I met Welles in 1970, I was finishing my book on him, and I went to Hollywood to interview John Ford for my next book. And I called Peter Bogdanovich, who I admired as a young critic and filmmaker, and he was on the phone with Orson. He said, I'm on the other line with Orson, could you hold on? And I thought, wow. I didn't think that Welles was in America because he was kind of mysterious in those days. He was living in Europe, and we'd just read little items in Variety about him. And so he said, Orson would like to meet you. And he gave me a phone number to call him the next day. When I called him, the first thing he said was, we're about to start shooting a film, would you like to be in it? Which kind of knocked me out. He was planning The Other Side of the Wind, which is his roman à clef about Hollywood, and he was casting film buffs and film critics and filmmakers to play comic versions of themselves. Peter had recommended me, and turned out Welles had been reading my pieces on him, which I'd been writing for film magazines, including my piece on Chimes at Midnight in Film Quarterly, in which I called it Welles's masterpiece. This is back in 1969. And I sent him a book I did on a collection of articles that I and other people had done in Wisconsin. And it turned out he had read these things, and I didn't know it. And so I met him, and he, when I walked in, he had my book on his mantelpiece. And he said, finally, I get to meet my favorite critic. And I said, geez, why am I your favorite critic? He said, because you're the only one who understands what I'm trying to do, which was awfully nice. We talked a lot about Chimes at Midnight, and one thing he said was he had had a telegram recently from Charlton Heston, who was in Touch of Evil, of course. And Heston said he'd always wanted to make a film about Prince Hal and Falstaff. He said, this is the part of your life. I would love to see you play this. Would you like to be in it? And Welles, he started to laugh, but I could see the laughter kind of choked in his mouth, that Heston didn't even know he had made this film, you know, which was kind of indicative of how obscure the film was. He later had an experience with Anne Baxter, who had lunch with him and said, why don't we make a film of the Immortal story? And she didn't know he had already done it. He was kind of depressed by that.
Master Shallow, I owe you 1,000 pounds.
Yes, Sir John, which I beseech you to let me have home with me.
That can hardly be, Master Seller. Do not you grieve at this. Look you, he was seen thus to the world.
So we had a good talk about the film, and I asked him, I kind of am embarrassed to say this, but I said, gee, I wish you had made the film in color. I mean, it's such a beautifully shot black and white film. And he said, I would have refused to make this film in color. He felt that black and white, he said, was the actor's friend.
Unless you should give me your doublet and stuff me out with straw. I beseech you, Sir John. Let me have 500 of my 1,000.
Sir, I will be as good as my word. This that you have seen was but a color.
A color that I fear you will die in.
Fear no colors. Come.
He felt that there were no good film performances in color, which is obviously a bit of an exaggeration. He said this film is a film of faces. Everything of importance in the film is on the faces of the characters. When I talked to Howard Hawks, for example, he said he had the chance to make Red River in color, but he felt that color in those days was too gaudy, and it was usually used for comedies and musicals. He said black and white also gives you the feeling of being older. And I think that's part of the point of Chimes at Midnight. It really looks like the Middle Ages. Edmond Richard, the cameraman, said that they used very high contrast photography, very strong blacks and very strong whites. It's really a beautiful film in terms of the lighting. For example, the light coming from the windows in the castle is spectacular, these shafts of light. It's almost a religious feeling, although it's very cold. And they used aluminum dust. They would throw it in the air right before the shot, and Richard said it lasted for about 30 seconds, but it gave an extraordinary effect.
Jack Falstaff, kind.
He said Welles wanted the faces of the people to stand out. He always wanted the faces to be well lit. And Richard thought that was a vestige of Welles's theatrical roots.
Banish not him, thy hair is company. Banish not him, thy hair is company. Banish plump Jack and banish all the world.
I do. I will.
Welles considered Shakespeare the staff of life, he called him. Welles started a Todd School in Woodstock, Illinois, which was, he called his Camelot. And that's where he got to be a director and did all kinds of adventurous stage productions. And in 1931, he did a production called Richard III, in which he combined that play with other Shakespearean plays. And he took a very free approach to editing Shakespeare even at that time. So he had the chutzpah at the age of 15, 16 to do that. This is the program from Richard III. He and his headmaster, Roger Hill, did this play together. So this helps explain what he's doing in Chimes at Midnight with combining parts of Henry IV, Part 1, Part 2, Henry V, part of Merry Wives of Windsor, and Holinshed's Chronicles into one great mashup of Shakespeare. He writes, Richard III, our sixth and final offering of the season, is something of a patchwork, a Shakespearean goulash. 4 histories and a tragedy have gone into its making, and of the original kill, only the choicest cuts have been preserved. Has the Stratford pot pie a precedent? We think so. And he talked about how in the 1700s, 1800s, there were what they called acting versions that actor managers, famous actors would do. And he focuses in Chimes at Midnight on the Falstaff Hal parts of the plays. And he makes it a very different play in a sense, because Shakespeare didn't write a play called Falstaff or Chimes at Midnight. That's Orson Welles' interpretation. And it's amazing how he takes a line here, a line there, and moves it completely around. He had complete freedom, and he felt that Shakespeare would not mind, actually. He thought Shakespeare would want the plays to play well. But he gives lines from one character to another character, and he would often take a speech and kind of condense it and cut out lines and things. And sometimes I think he actually improves upon the original.
Give me a cup of sack.
How now, Jack? Where hast thou been?
Oh, plague on all cowards. Go thy ways, old Jack. Die when thou wilt. If manhood, good manhood, be not forgot upon the face of the earth, then I'm a shot and herring. There lives not 3 good men unhanged in England, and one of them is fat and grows old. God help the while.
How now, woolsack?
Chimes at Midnight is by far his greatest performance. Citizen Kane, he's terrific, of course. He plays quite a range of, from youth to old age. But Falstaff is so personal to him for many reasons. Part of it is obvious. He was this large, jovial bon vivant who loved life and valued friendship above all, and was a lovable character, but he was a rogue and he was constantly broke.
I call thee coward? See thee damned, I call thee coward. And I'd give £1,000 if I could run as fast as thou canst.
And then the theme of betrayal, I think, is the main theme in his film work. Films are usually about two men who love each other and one betrays the other. And that's what Falstaff is. It's the classic story in literature of that. And so he was drawn to it for that reason, too. And in Chimes at Midnight, I think he's more emotionally naked than he ever was on the screen before or since. He said Falstaff was the greatest conception of a good man in all of literature. He said his flaws are very minor and his virtues are very large.
Well, 'tis no matter. I have the wars for my colour. Hey, lad. My pension shall seem the more reasonable. A good wit will make use of anything. I shall turn diseases to commodity.
Falstaff! Good night.
Now comes in the sweetest morsel of the night. And we must dance and leave it unpicked.
Wells said that the two films that he thought were the most personal that he made were Chimes of Midnight and The Magnificent Ambersons. Ambersons, he felt Booth Tarkington's novel had based the character of Eugene Morgan, the automobile inventor, on his own father, Wells's own father, who Tarkington actually knew. There is some of that in there, and Wells's father was a kind of a playboy, and he invented some things. He was a businessman of some repute, and he also frequented stage plays and vaudeville and showgirls, and had he's kind of a Falstaffian character in his own way. Unfortunately, drank himself to death in a Chicago hotel room. And this was a real trial for the young Orson, that his father was deteriorating. His mother died when he was 9, and his father died when he was 15. Why is Chimes of Midnight so personal to him? Part of it is that he had this obsession with the lost Eden. It's a big theme in his work. And as he said, that's probably the main theme in Western literature, the lament for things we've lost with modernization. And he didn't like the modern world much. He liked the medieval world. So he's lamenting the loss of merry old England, which he admitted was a mythical concept that never really existed. So that's part of it, a big part of it. But I think there's a deeper reason for Chimes of Midnight. I thought about this for a long time. Wells never finished an autobiography, but he did a couple of pieces for the Paris Vogue. One was on his father, and he ended by saying that he believed he had killed his father, and he said, I'll write about this more, and then he never did, understandably. And he elaborated in some interviews, and he really felt he had literally killed his father because his father drank himself to death. And the death certificate says he died of kidney and heart failure, but there were rumors that he committed suicide, which may not be literally true. But what happened was that Wells went on a trip with his father where he was really drunk to Asia, and a lot of embarrassment, a lot of problems, as you would have with an alcoholic parent. And his kind of guardians, they convinced him, he said, to ostracize his father, what we now call tough love. Tell your father I won't see you until you stop drinking. And then a few months later, his father dies all alone in a hotel room, which is a horrible tragedy for Orson. He said he never got over that. He felt guilty his whole life, and he said he hated psychoanalysis because he thought you should live with your guilt and just accept it. So the betrayal of the king, when he betrays Falstaff, is just like what Orson did to his father by cutting him off. Wells is very focused on Hal as a kind of villainous character, but he has great sympathy for him because I think he sees himself in Hal rejecting Falstaff being the father. But it's very complex because he identifies totally with Falstaff as well. I mean, he's so much invested in Falstaff emotionally. Wells had other father figures. Roger Hill, his headmaster, he lived with for a while. Roger Hill was the guy who got him into the theater, and they collaborated on some of these early plays, and they did a book together called Everybody's Shakespeare. Roger Hill was an innovative educator who had this progressive school with all kinds of fascinating things. They had a printing plant. They had an airplane. They had this motor home where they would take trips. They would go to Chicago to see plays all the time. They'd take trips around the country. And they had a radio station. It's amazing. And Welles thrived there. He found his vocation. And so they did this book called Everybody's Shakespeare, and Orson did, it was 4 Shakespeare plays, and Orson did the notations, and in the margins he drew drawings of the sets and the scenes and everything. It's a wonderful book. And he also had another father figure, Maurice Bernstein, who was a doctor, who was his official guardian when his father died. Bernstein had been a family friend who was somehow emotionally involved with Welles's mother, like a rival with his father. It was a very complex relationship, and Welles always blamed Dr. Bernstein for ripping him off financially, although some of that may be exaggerated, but there wasn't much left of his inheritance when he finally got it when he turned 25. But he was kind of a rich young kid who had the liberty to travel around the world, you know, but he always had to kind of coax the money out of Dr. Bernstein, who was deeply passionate about Welles's genius. He was the guy who first spread the word that Orson was a genius and helped promote his legend in articles in Saturday Evening Post and other places. And so he was another figure. So Welles had several father figures. The battle scene is one of the greatest battle scenes in the history of film, and Pauline Kael compared it to John Ford and Kurosawa, which is very apt. They're obviously influences. It's a remarkable scene. I asked Welles how many extras he had, and he said 180. And he was very proud of the fact that that's all he had, because there's supposed to be, you know, tens of thousands of people. But he only had 180 people for a day or two, and most of the time he had like 12 to 14. And he said he cut it with the principle of a blow given and a blow received. And that kind of keeps happening, and there are interludes in the middle of it where other things happen, but it sort of builds up to a crescendo of extreme violence, and he uses fog partly to disguise the fact that there aren't too many people there. And the quick cutting is very characteristic of the later Welles. Esteve Riamba, a Spanish scholar who's written a fine book on Chimes of Midnight, said that the battle scene partly was inspired by a reproduction of the Battle of San Romano between the Florentines and the Sienese, a triptych in 3-meter-long panels painted by Paolo Uccello in 1432, in which horsemen are mixed with foot soldiers in a chaos not unlike the movies. And Welles was influenced by paintings quite a lot, and Edmond Richard mentioned Rembrandt and Bruegel. Welles was influenced by a German painter named Eduard von Grützner, who painted Falstaff and based it partly on the Verdi opera. But Welles said to me when I first met him that day, he said, movies should be rough. And I was kind of shocked, because here's the guy who made Citizen Kane, which is a perfect gem-like film. It really opened my eyes to his later work, starting when he left Hollywood to do It's All True in 1942, his documentary on location in Brazil. He was working a lot with non-actors. He was working on real locations. He didn't have cranes. He didn't have dollies. So he was having to be rough in the sense of taking life as it comes, rather than having everything pre-planned and carefully worked out, and didn't use a lot of special effects like in Kane. There are a lot of use of the optical printer, and he didn't have the great technicians, he told me, that he had in Hollywood. So his later work is rough in a sense, rough and ready in some ways, and the cutting disguises some of the problems he had with keeping the cast together. A lot of use of doubles in the film. Whenever you see people from the back, it's usually a double. So the editing kind of works around that, but it's very ingeniously edited.
Say, young Percy and Lord Worcester are 50,000 strong. Here is Sir Walter Blunt, my lord, new lighted from his horse.
My liege, Northumberland lies sick, but a great power of English and of Scots follow young Henry Percy.
Yea, there thou makest me sad.
And all of the film is post-synced, which I didn't realize at the time. And that leads to some lack of sync, you know. But I always felt that Welles would sacrifice synchronization for a line reading. Like in The Trial, there's some scenes where Tony Perkins is talking and his mouth isn't moving at all. And Welles dubbed lines in there.
England shall give him office, honor, might,
For the fifth Harry from curbed license plucks the muzzle of restraint, and the wild dog shall flesh his tooth in every innocent.
I never thought to hear you speak again.
Thy wish was father, Harry, to that thought. I stayed too long by thee, I weary thee. Oh, pardon me, my liege. But wherefore did you take away the crown?
God witness with me when I found no course of breath within your majesty, how cold it struck my heart. Thinking you dead, I spake unto this crown as having sense, and thus upbraided it.
Welles was great with sound, and he liked the idea that he could do it in the post-synchronization period. Plus, you know, when you're shooting on location, it's hard to get really good sound.
We that take purses go by the moon. How now? Who picked me pocket? Hostess! Hostess!
Sir John!
I fell asleep.
One of the problems that people had in America with the film was the first reel was somewhat out of sync. The rest of it is pretty much okay, but now it's been fixed with the restoration. But I never minded very much that it was a bit out of sync. Douglas Gomery, who came up with the theory first that Welles was not a failed Hollywood director, as most people tend to think of him as this guy who made these two terrific Hollywood films, and then everything kind of went to hell after that. Douglas felt that Welles was an independent filmmaker from the beginning who happened briefly to have the resources of major studios. And then when that fell apart, he went back to his roots as an independent. And he was expelled from Hollywood partly because he was blacklisted. And it's no accident. He left in early November of '47, right after the big HUAC hearings. And he would have been ostracized for that reason. So he saw the handwriting on the wall and went to Europe. Also, his Hollywood career was in ruins because of the commercial failure of Macbeth and Lady from Shanghai, which came out in '48. So he was considered in disgrace, and he couldn't get films made, so he thought Europe would be more congenial. So he was really an avant-garde guerrilla filmmaker in his European period, which lasted for 10 years until he came back to do Touch of Evil in Hollywood, which he said was a real treat. He said there's no pleasure like working with a Hollywood crew. But that came to a bad end because the studio was horrified by the film, and that really ended his Hollywood studio career. He went back to Europe, made some more films, came back in 1970 to Hollywood, and that's when I met him. And for the last 15 years of his life, he was shooting films almost every day. And people didn't even know about it because these films were often not finished, and his films were not distributed properly. But he was always a guerrilla artist, even in his theater days. He was doing all kinds of experimental things, and that was part of his problem commercially, that he was too experimental and avant-garde for the audience. Obviously, he had a lot of bad things happen to him. Ambersons was eviscerated, and he was run out of America. I mean, you know, he said he had the greatest good luck of any director and then the worst bad luck of any director, and that's true. However, the man made, in his lifetime, 12 completed films, of which 6 or 7 are among the greatest films ever made. He has a tremendous body of work. But Renoir said a great thing about Welles. He said Welles was an aristocrat who worked in a popular medium. And that gets to the heart of what's Welles's problem. That he said he should have stayed in the theater. His first wife said, stay in the theater, you'll be happier. And late in life, he said, I think I should have done that. But he said, I fell in love with films as the most jealous mistress a man could ever have. He said, I just loved my girl. He was actually a very efficient director. Charlton Heston said he was the most efficient director he ever worked with. I saw that firsthand on the other side of the wind, that Welles shot tremendous amount of takes in one day, and he worked 18 hours a day. He wore out all the young people on the cast and crew. And he could improvise, he could make up stuff on the spur of the moment. It was fascinating to watch him reacting to what actors were doing, and if some mistake happened, he would incorporate it in the film. Then later in life, he would do a lot of crummy acting performances. He was heroically unwilling to compromise as a director. He didn't work as a director for hire, but he would totally compromise as an actor. He would do almost anything. There were a few things he turned down. He wouldn't be in Caligula, and he turned down the role of a pig in a Pasolini film. He thought that was insulting. he would turn up in all these awful films, so most people would just see him in these bad films because they wouldn't see Chimes of Midnight or The Immortal Story. They didn't have much distribution. So they thought, oh, isn't it terrible that he's debasing his talent? And then he would do all these commercials. That's how he supported himself. He wanted to be a great popular artist. He said, when I was young, I wanted to be the American Charles Dickens. But he said, I realized I wasn't a popular artist.
Now I remember his name.
Falstaff.
If that man should be hugely given, he deceiveth me. For Harry, I see virtue in his looks. Him keep with. The rest, banish.
Dost thou speak like a king? Do thou stand for me?
I do think Chimes of Midnight, though, if it had had different circumstances and Bosley Crowther had not attacked it, if it had been handled properly by the right distributor with some money behind it, they could have gotten it out to the general public who would have loved it. You didn't have to be a Shakespeare scholar or a great film buff to love Chimes of Midnight. It did win 2 prizes at the Cannes Film Festival in 1966. In Europe, it was acclaimed, like a lot of his work was. But hardly anybody has seen this film, even now. And when I run into people who say that Orson Welles declined and had this tragic downfall, which I don't think is true, I would always say, have you seen Chimes of Midnight? And the answer invariably was no, because if they had seen that, they wouldn't think that.